my introduction, it's pretty simple. I'm a regulator. That's my job, and obviously you're the industry primarily that I'm responsible for keeping an oversight on, reviewing. Before I start on the real estate industry reforms, probably one of the benefits of being the last speaker is I can feed off some of the previous speakers, and just from fair trading's perspective, David mentioned earlier that customer service and customers, and I can't, from my perspective, say that enough, that whether they be buyers, sellers, landlords, tenants, respect all of the customers, because the complaints and the information that comes to us, that reduces. If we see businesses do that, they do reduce, and we do get positive feedback too about industry, so quite good. Greg mentioned about deposits, etc., so on. We get a lot of complaints. If there's going to be a dispute about a property sale, it's the deposits, it's the money. So just be aware of that, take that on. And with Rosie Strata, at times I throw my hands up. Strata's there, it's growing. We administer Strata, we don't regulate Strata schemes, we administer the legislation. We regulate the Strata managers. So we can look after the managers and make sure their professionalism's there and they're adhering to the legislation. But obviously the schemes themselves, large group of people thrown into that context, and there's going to be disputes and there's mechanisms. But if you are a property manager, I agree, be aware of what's happening in the scheme, be aware of who the manager is, the strata manager, because you will actually get tenants again. And if they've got an issue, they'll complain about you. They won't complain about the strata manager, they'll complain about the property manager, because that's their context. So just feeding to that. Who am I? As I say, Matt, I'm the Director Market Relations, Real Estate and Property Division. Market Relations, I've met some of you before, by the way, but Market Relations is a simple term for the compliance and complaints area. It's a very nice term, but it is basically that. It's where they all come. I am working for a fair trading, and obviously being in enforcement and government for some time. I'm the person that sits at home with my 4 children while they're watching their programs, and a real estate ad comes on. One of them was mentioned earlier today, and I'm the one that was my eyesight. I race up to the TV to read the fine print. I love the fine print. What does it say? What are they not saying is more what I'm interested in. So, and that's what I do. It's my nature. Love reading that, and I'll continue to do that. So, you know, when we talk about what fees and charges, that's what I want to know. I want to know exactly what's the deal, because some deals aren't fair. So we do look at that constantly. Some of the disruptors, I think the word was called, they're not so much disruptors, and we do review these business models as they emerge. The majority of them, I will say, are compliant with the Australian Consumer Law, the Property Stock and Business Agents Act, if need be, etc. So they do comply, but they are just a different model. Customers are endorsing them in the sense that they're using them. So again, I would agree that probably something to consider moving forward with your own businesses, and whether or not that's you can work with them, or there's some ideas or innovation that they're using that may be something that you may wish to consider. Real estate reforms. 18 months ago we started a new division. We've been working closely with David in particular, and Ted made the mistake of walking into the door about 6 or 8 months ago to the Real Estate Reference Group, and we've been meeting probably monthly, even to talk about the industry, talk about the professionalism of the industry, and the industry raising that level of professionalism. And that's not me as a regulator of fair trading talking, that's what I'm hearing from you, and particularly from the EAC and other associations. It's not to say that you're not professional, it's just about raising that level. And actually probably, I mean, people will say, Tom, what do you think of a real estate agent? I'm not going to answer that. I think you might answer that yourselves. But it's more, can that level of professionalism be raised? Is there a future of co-regulation, self-regulation, and looking at those? So thus the real estate reforms was born. And we looked at it, and we released a paper recently, and I'm sure you've all read that from cover to end. I did meet with one head of a franchise group recently, and he's time poor in the sense he's very busy, and he said, I can't read. I said, just read the reforms, Annexure 3, read that. Just read the list of reforms, that's all you really need to know. But there's a lot of padding in there which will give some context to why these reforms have come about and what we're really looking at achieving. This slide here, I'll be honest, I'm not going to talk too much about this. What I'm more interested in here is just those numbers at the bottom. That's of June last year. And I would say if I did a survey of this room, that would come out. We'd have about a mix of, probably about 40% licence holders, 40% certificate holders, and then if we use the corporations, we'd look at that as our licensees in charge, or our principals, our business operators. So that's probably something key to think when we start talking about some of these changes in the next few minutes. I also want to throw in at this point, what I'm going to speak about today, this is not going to happen till at least 1 July next year. Okay, so there's time. Okay, there's time for things to start happening now, that's number one. And the second part of it is too, that there will be further consultation. There will be draft bills come out for you to review, and I would suggest when they do come out that you do review them, whether you feed them back through to the EAC or whether you actually comment yourselves and provide any submissions. But they will come out soon. There was meant to be a draft bill out by now, but obviously change in Premier can actually delay these processes, so we acknowledge that, but we are working quite hard and frantically behind the scenes, particularly with the reference group which Ted and David sit on, to actually get this information out to you. So what are the key reforms? I'm not going to go through everything in the reforms paper because there's quite a lot which the impact isn't as high as what some of these are, but we're looking at reducing licence categories. I'll talk a little bit more of that in a minute. Improved qualification requirements. I'm going to add to that, it's not only improved qualification, it's improved qualification and experience requirements. And I think that's key too, because it's not just qualification, training, formal training. Improved CPD requirements. We did a program, you might have seen media in the last 2 days, we did a compliance program late last year that went into this year, and basically 1 in 5 certificate holders, licence holders out there hadn't completed their CPD, but they ticked on their renewal form they had actually completed their CPD. So we needed to look at that. So obviously the reforms have had a look at improved CPD requirements. Restricted duties for certificate and licence holders, and that will feed into a new licensing regime, which I'll discuss today, looking at that. But basically saying that you have an entry level, you then have your more experienced operator or salesperson, property manager, and then you have someone who wants to run a business or someone who wants to manage a real estate office, I guess is the best way of saying it. And the greater responsibility for the licensee in charge. From our perspective, we want to make sure that the people that are running these offices have the highest level of qualification they can, are experienced in the industry and know what they're doing. So that's very briefly the aim of the real estate reforms paper in a sense, and some of the key reforms. And I apologise for some of these slides, they're a little bit, a lot more text than I would have liked myself, but I'll quickly try and explain. So we're looking at changing the current licensing regime. Currently we have real estate agent's licence, on-site residential property manager, buyer's agent, business agent, and we have corporate licences sitting on top of that. We're actually looking at combining the real estate agent's licence, the on-site residential property manager and the buyer's agent all into a real estate agent's licence. So those others, particularly the on-site residential property manager and buyer's agent, will no longer be there. You will require a real estate agent's licence. A business agent, if you're selling property as well, you'll need a real estate agent's licence. If you're not selling property, you're just selling the business, you won't need a licence, and we're going to be removing the requirement to licence corporations. And that'll make a little bit more sense shortly when we talk about the licensee in charge. Strata managing agents will remain the same, and stock and station agents will remain the same. So those licenses. So there's a reduction in the classes of licences. We'll be removing 3 classes very readily, and we'll also be, as I say, that requirement for corporate licences. The reforms will look at removing those. And again, I'm going to go back. There'll be further consultation, and there's a lot of work to be done on this. Yeah, this is the start. Even though it's been happening for 18 months, this is actually, we're only probably a third of the way through. There's a lot more work to be done on actually the transition and how this will look. So, if we're looking to the future, what will it look like for a certificate of registration holder? Currently, 4 units of competency to apply for a certificate of registration, be granted and work in the industry. That's going to be increased to 7 units of competency, an additional 3, and those 7 units will be derived from the Certificate 4 in property services, so they will come out of that to contribute towards it. That's your entry point. But the certificate of registration will have a lifespan. It will have a lifespan of 4 years. So there's no renewal. Excuse me. So anyone coming into the industry, new entrants into the industry post the reforms, will require the 7 units of competency. They will be issued a certificate of registration with an expiry of 4 years. Industry, currently, their certificate of registration will continue for 4 years. And anybody that's out of the industry but has been in it in the last 5 years and may not have renewed their certificate of registration can come back, and as long as it's been in the last 5 years, they will be given that 4-year conditional certificate of registration. In that 4 years, we require them to complete a Certificate 4 in property services. So they will complete the remaining, and Rosie, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's 17. I think it's 24 in total. Yeah, so there's an additional 17 units of competency that they will need to complete. But they can do that quickly. They can do that in 12 months per se. So the earliest they can be granted a licence, a certificate of registration holder, the absolute earliest is 12 months. Because they must also have 12 months experience in the industry. And we took this on from feedback from industry. And I'm sure there's people in the room will say, I did 3 years at TAFE and I did extensive training before I could get my licence. In a sense, we've taken a step back, but I think there's merit in doing it. So there'll be 12 months experience, must complete the Cert 4, and then that certificate holder can apply for a licence. There's a couple of things. During that 4-year transition, because they will be doing the Certificate 4, that will account for their CPD. They won't have to do the additional CPD. That will be classed as their CPD as long as they're going through that process. And where we talk about restricted duties, what we're talking, and this hasn't been finalised yet, but what we're talking about with certificate of registration holder, they can do everything they can do now in a sense, but they won't be able to bind parties to agreements. So they may be able to sign an agreement in the future with a customer, but it will need to be countersigned by a licence holder. So certificate of registration holders in the future will not be able to bind parties to an agreement. They also won't be able to touch trust accounts. Okay, and you'll see a little bit more with the trust accounts as we go through the licence classes. But again, that's being discussed at the reference group, and it will be discussed further with industry as to what those restricted duties should look like. The aim is to get people to complete the training, Cert 4, obtain a licence and be at that higher level of training. It's not to say that certificate holders out there now, a lot of them aren't doing a great job, they are. But the reality is it's about raising that level of professionalism. You're right, Dave.
We are coming up with fair trading in certain roles, receptionists, marketing, people they won't have. So not everyone will have that. We'll go from a certificate to a licence.
Yep. So, good point. Thank you, David. We're also looking at, there is functions for some time now since we've been talking, there's functions within your offices. They've probably currently got the certificate of registration, and that's not a bad thing, don't get me wrong, that's quite a good thing. But ultimately there will be functions within your office that won't require a licence or a certificate in the future. I mean, they're not selling real estate, they're not managing property. So we're looking at that too, which could actually, again, reduce some red tape within the office. I mean, from a development perspective, it is good, obviously, for people to develop. So I encourage that, but obviously, within your own office, you may not need to. If your receptions are receiving funds and they're involved in the management of property, they'll need a licence, absolutely. Yep, absolutely. But if they're just answering the phone, and I'm not saying they do, there's administrative in the background that they may not be dealing with customers, for instance, and they may not be managing property or anything. And this is what David mentioned. We will be talking about this, and we'll be taking that guidance from industry as to what these roles might be. Licence holders. So you've gone through your journey, you've got your certificate of registration, and I've probably explained most of this, but to be a licence holder, you obviously need to complete your Cert 4 and you need your 12 months experience. Existing licence holders will be no change. They'll be directly transferred over to the new licensing regime, and any transitional applicants. So again, when we look at where you've held a licence in the last 5 years and its equivalent qualifications, but you'll still need the 12 months experience. There will be a 5-year licence option, so we're looking at, rather than annual renewal, we're looking at putting in a 5-year renewal. CPD, so from the CPD perspective, there will be 6 hours of CPD per annum. There'll be 3 hours which will be mandatory. So that will be determined by a committee which hasn't been formed obviously as yet, but it'll be government and industry, and they'll be taking into consideration industry trends, for instance, complaints received, compliance levels, what issues have been detected, and that CPD will be based and targeting those issues on an annual basis that are being seen within the industry and where that ongoing learning may be required. And there's 3 hours of elective, okay, so that's pretty much what you're doing now. So that will be, there'll be a variety of, and obviously the guidelines will be reviewed as part of this, but that will be very similar, that lower level of learning, I guess you could say. If you're undertaking a diploma, which we'll talk about in a minute, but to become a licensee in charge, you need to complete a diploma, which I think is another 4 units of competence. I'm not sure, so we'll just...
Another 9.
Another 9, is it? There you go, so another 9. So not a trainer, definitely. So if you're undertaking, though, the diploma during this time period, that will be considered in lieu of elective CPD, so the 3 hours. You'll still need to complete the 3 hours of mandatory. So a total of 6 hours per year, and we're going to look at changing the way that you report this. Currently it's reported on the renewal of your licence. We're going to the 5-year licence option, so it's going to be, we're going to try and fix it to a calendar point, so whether it be March to March, we're going to look at a calendar point. So from an audit perspective, easier for you to audit, easier for a licensee in charge to audit, and definitely easier for me to audit if need be, or fair trading. So we did find that in the recent program too. There's a lot of confusion for people out there with their renewal and whether that, when they actually did the training, whether they carried over any points. We're also going to remove that provision of carrying, currently I think it's 11, you can carry up to 11 over. So we're going to remove that, so there won't be that carryover provision. And when we say duties, restriction of duties, cannot do trust transactions, what we're talking about there is we're talking about money coming out of that trust account in particular. We're putting the onus on the licensee in charge to be responsible for the ingoing and outgoing of that trust account, because when we see major defalcation and money missing, that's the questions we ask. How can that money be going out so readily? And unfortunately there is several $1 million per annum that does go out of trust accounts that shouldn't go out, and that's what we know about, I should say, with the level of auditing. So that's licence holders. So licensee in charge, this will be a new class of licence. So the corporate licence is being removed, but there will be a new class of licence. It will be licensee in charge. To become a licensee in charge, you will need a diploma. You will also need 2 years experience and evidence of competency across the real estate. So we're talking sales and property management, not one or the other. You will need evidence of competency. Or any current licence holder is eligible to apply. So we're going to actually allow current licence holders will be eligible to apply for the new class. And we're going to see if we can set up for transitional, so business continuity perspective, that you can apply before this new act and these reforms commence. So we're going to look at setting that licensing regime up so, as I say, your continuity can go. And there's a 2-year transition for evidence of experience. There'll be a 5-year licence option, so very similar to a licence holder. Difference in CPD, you'll have the 3 hours mandatory, exactly the same as a licence holder, and it will be determined on the same merits. You'll have 3 hours of elective, no difference there, but you'll have an additional 3 hours business related. So that additional 3, that will be 9 hours for, and these are people that are running offices. These are where we call them principals, licensee in charge. Whether you have one, whether you have multiple, these will be the people that are running the offices, or the office I should say, not offices, the office, and in some case multiple. Again, looking at a calendar year, and their responsibilities will be, they will be our go-to person if there's issues in the trust account, definitely, or there's issues within that business. They will be ensuring CPD compliance. That's why we're looking at making it on an annual calendar basis, because it will be easier for that person, whoever that may be, to actually audit the CPD requirements. And training and development focus, so looking at their procedures and that development, ongoing development within the business. That's it from me. So open to questions.
Matt,
yep.
Just on the last licensee in charge, we had a 2-year transitional experience over in the right-hand column.
Yep.
Transitional arrangements. What exactly do you mean by that? So somebody's got a licence the day before the new reforms come in.
Yep.
30th of June next year.
Yep.
Supposedly. What's that mean about the 2-year transition? So
it means that in 2 years they'll have to provide competency. So, they will have, so that's what we're considering. Remember, these aren't concrete, those ones at this point.
The proposal is it's not a grandfather forever; it's a grandfather for 2 years.
Correct.
Gotcha.
Yep.
Matt,
Sorry, you're right. No, you go. You're right. Sorry, the eyes are adjusting to the...
You were saying, and I was really glad to hear that you're looking like the competency must be in both sales and property management. Most of the principals have only ever done sales. What sort of competency will you be looking for them to show in property management?
Well, interesting you say, good question, and the answer to that at this point is we are working through that, and we're working through it with David and Ted in particular and some of the other industry associations as to what that should look like. And that has been a question that's been raised because you do, look, there's no doubt in this industry, your career generally will take that path or that. You will focus on the sales or you'll focus on property management. There are some that do both and they do it quite well, but you will. So we are looking at that and considering that. And remember going back to the beginning of my presentation today, we are talking to you and we will take that feedback on. This isn't, the actual licensee classes, is the reforms have said that will be a reform, so that's going to happen. The actual transitional, how we do this, that's still open to discussion. So we will be taking that feedback and working through it, but there's no definitive answer yet.
Tom, this is a bit out of left field. We all deal with realestate.com and they don't allow you to list a property on their site unless you're a real estate agent, unless you're licensed. You can't list your property if you're a private seller. They list multiples of properties all over Australia from agencies that do cheap commission arrangements, sell my home, etc., etc. And they allow it on there because they're licensed agents. But those agents don't do sales inspection reports on properties. They might be in Queensland and list a property in Victoria, yet they still are allowed to list properties on portals and purport themselves to be agents and charge lesser commissions.
Yep.
But if I was to list a property, I've got to physically do a sales inspection report. How do they do that and avoid doing a sales inspection report and still get to act as agents?
Look, I'm not going to answer that at the time. I'm happy to talk to you offline on that. The only reason is there's more involved with just a simple answer, because there are so many different models out there. And I agree, there are through the portals, and we obviously don't regulate the portals from the point of view of who's advertising on them. We're looking at who and it's you who is advertising, and we will look through as to how what is their business model and do they require a licence in New South Wales. They may be licensed, and whether or not their advertising is misleading.